We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
Grievances we could go into with this system. I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. Today, we're not talking just sports, we're talking politics. Disclaimer, we are not a political show in any way, shape, or form. We will not be offering any political opinions, but it all wraps up into our discussion today on executive orders. So we'll start with the overarching topic. Why are people in Washington getting involved in college athletics?
Yeah, and I think that's a really kind of a complex issue because there's a lot of reasons why they're getting involved in college sports right now, and most of it's the NCAA doing very heavy lobbying. Shout out to Front Office Sports' Amanda Kristovich, who has been reporting a lot on the lobbying expenses that have been spent by the NCAA, by the conferences themselves. And it is in the millions of dollars, over the past few years. And really ever since 2019 or so, which is when California passed the Fair Pay-to-Pay Act, the NCAA has been going to Congress with three major priorities and very much amplified after the Alston decision, which we've, of course, discussed endlessly on the show. But the three priorities that they've really had are, one, an antitrust exemption, or at least some sort of antitrust exemption, or trying not to call it an antitrust exemption, but it very much is what they're looking for, an antitrust exemption, even if it's limited. Two would be a firm statement saying that college athletes are not employees, to avoid that issue and avoid the issues that are coming up in the Johnson case. And then third, preemption of state law, because right now we have a couple of dozen different state laws that are doing various different things. And, there continues to be kind of a race to the bottom in a lot of ways with these laws that in a way where I think the NCAA is pretty worried about it, or clearly they're pretty worried about it.
I also think that it can't be ignored that there are powerful people who are interested in college sports. And so a lot of the, whether it even be that much of a matter of an interest for a senator or a representative, it does matter to a lot of their constituents, and a lot of their constituents who have power. And so I think that kind of sums up why you're seeing a lot of talk about it. It is it's a story of national interest. College sports is of national interest. It is different, and it's unique to the U.S. in the way that it operates. And there's a lot of firmly held beliefs around it, a lot of collegiality around it. It does impact higher education, which should be part of a national interest, congressional interest. But I think that the power brokers who are involved are also a big key to why it keeps kind of coming up. It keeps just staying on the docket just enough to always be talked about, because everybody wants to know that their senator is working on it and trying to help their school.
Yeah, and if you look at the representatives and senators that are really kind of leading the charge on both sides of this issue, or all the different sides of this issue, because there are a lot of these sides. I mean, you have Ted Cruz, of course, who's the senator of Texas, Texas A&M, University of Texas, Texas Tech, all those different schools there that have been very much in his ear, clearly. You have, in the House, you have Representative Bill Rakes, who, represents Gainesville, which is, of course, University of Florida. On the other side, you have, Lori Trahan, who represents Massachusetts, which you may not think, and I'm saying this as a UMass alum, you may not see as like a hotbed of college sports, but she herself was a volleyball player at Georgetown, so she has a personal interest here. You also have Representative Baumgartner, Eastern Washington. Washington State has been just a little bit affected by some of the changes in college sports over the years, so they clearly have a lot to say. But yeah, all these people with clearly vested interests, and that doesn't even get into Cory Booker, who was another college athlete, Chris Murphy, like all these different, the main players here, and most of Congress. I think it's been clear that they've taken kind of a limited interest here, but the ones who have taken an interest here have been very, very, very strong in what they're saying and kind of their positions on these issues.
Well, I think going back to your question too, Dom, like we've discussed all of this over the last 5 episodes. Everything that has transpired since, Board of Regents through House and Alston, I mean, it's really stripped away a lot of the protections that the NCAA had that allowed it to set its rules. So with everything getting stripped away, now everything's being challenged, and nobody's really gone back to sit down and rebuild the framework of what the NCAA is going to be. They're just challenging it in court repeatedly, whether it's, eligibility issues, or they're like, we're going to set, a rev share cap. And now people are already going, this isn't enough. We can't be doing this. It really goes back to what we've talked about these last 5 episodes. If nobody's going to sit down in a room and decide with everybody representing all angles, like Sam brought up, if nobody's going to do that, then it has to be done somewhere. And it just appears like the entire industry is hoping that Congress will bail them out.
With that, you mentioned some of these senators have personal ties to schools, whether they're alum, athletes, coaches, but very few of them have worked majority of their career in college athletics. So where are these people getting their information and talking points from if they don't have that intimate knowledge that people who are in the industry do?
Everywhere. Everywhere.
Twitter.
If you have an opinion, you have an opportunity to share that with your legislator. But I also, by bringing people like Sam to Capitol Hill for a summit to have conversations, I mean, when they bring experts in, I mean, that you're getting an opinion, but a well-reasoned opinion. Otherwise, you're, sharing that with lobbyists and powerful people, and but everywhere.
Yeah, and we've had probably about a dozen different hearings on this, and that doesn't even count the summit that I had the privilege of attending in January, hosted by Representative Trahan. But we've had roughly a dozen of these hearings. We have another one coming up pretty soon, and a lot of them are following kind of the same formula in terms of who they're bringing in, but it's always going to be, a fairly diverse group of voices. You have, mid-major to low-major commissioners. You have athletic directors or presidents of the Big Ten or SEC schools. You have former college athletes that are, generally speaking, members of SAC. So maybe they have a particular opinion there. And of course, on the other side of it, you do bring in, people who are involved with kind of the fledgling unions of these organizations of college sports. The College Football Player Association, all these different ones, athletes.org. Yeah.
I think that it also can be helpful that the people in the room aren't necessarily ingrained in the system. I think that, you kind of can leave some of those biases at the door. I think the hearings are helpful to allow people who do have the expertise and are the subject matter experts to come through and say what matters and answer the questions and be able to provide the info. But we've also talked before about the antitrust element of this is really consumer protection. And if the legislators are more similar to the consumer as far as having this viewpoint of like how college athletics should be or how they want to, consume it or what that looks like, I think that helps to make sure that the people who are being protected through some of these laws are actually protected. You want to avoid some of those situations where somebody says, oh, we'll just wave a magic wand and make that work. Like, you got to avoid that. You got to do the work to figure out how does it actually work inside of a department, inside of a conference. What do athletes actually want for protections? So that, any future law or, act of Congress makes sense and fits the market. But it does help, I think, too, to not just have, the people who are inside the echo chamber be the only ones that are talking about what's going on.
I will say I think a lot of the frustration with all of this maneuvering and all of this, comes on because, Mike, I'm going to push back on something you said. You said that these hearings can be helpful. They can be. Are they actually helpful? Maybe not. Because I think for a lot of members of Congress, they see it as a great opportunity to tout how much they love local state school, which, is all well and dandy. But, you got to imagine some frustration from, all the experts in the room, all the stakeholders in the room who are sitting there thinking, we actually need to get something done. And it's been, about 7 years now since they started this lobbying campaign, 5 years since Alston, almost 5 years since Alston. And we haven't had really any kind of progress on anything from Congress. I mean, the closest we've come is, the recent progress on the SCORE Act, which, was able to get through committee, which is more than you can say for the other, roughly 10 bills that have been proposed. But did it actually get anywhere? No. And is it something where, maybe there's some optimism in some circles that it's going to get somewhere, but I think even the most optimistic about the SCORE Act, the most optimistic people about the SCORE Act are going to say, yeah, that's going to have a really tough time in the Senate.
So I want to go into some of these things that have been proposed, and we'll start with two that have been talked about fairly recently. Tommy Tuberville proposing a single transfer limit. Senator Schmidt and Cantwell drafting a bill about pooling media rights. So two-part question, but Joe, I want to start with you. Those two concepts, pooling media rights for all these schools and a single transfer limit. Objectively, do you think those are good or bad ideas? Whether or not they're feasible, we'll get into that, but what is the benefit, the pros and cons to those two scenarios?
Well, I mean, I think the ultimate benefit, to answer your question, is stability. Like, whether or not you agree or disagree with what's being proposed, like any sort of congressional act would provide stability, which gives departments, a pathway forward, knowing these are the rules, this is how we're going to operate. But the fact that we're talking about those two things, and the media pooling rights, like one group's looking at that and they think that could save the entire industry. But those are just two of the issues facing the industry. And when Sam said right out of the gate about all different angles, like those two things don't solve anything. So that's kind of why we're at where we're at. There's so many different things that need to be figured out. There's so many different angles to each of the issues, and nobody's come together and sat down and tried to figure them all out. Like, that's the problem.
Well, I think part of the problem is a lot of people kind of have to a certain extent, because the SCORE Act is intended to be comprehensive. The SCORE Act is intended to be kind of the one size fits all. We're going to solve every issue. And to that end, it's even been kind of a thing where, they said, oh, we're going to throw in, pooling media rights into it. We're going to, make all these changes to it. We're going to make changes to appease the Congressional Black Caucus and to appease the Republicans who are, kind of on the side of Cody Campbell, who, wants the pooled broadcast rights. And it's become this kind of this unwieldy thing. And, what we even have in text for the SCORE Act, what was most recently kind of written for it, doesn't even necessarily reflect, from everything we hear, what actually is going to be the bill at the end of the day. Like they said, okay, we're going to pass it through the Senate, and then we're going to make these amendments, or pass it through the House and make these amendments in the Senate. And I don't think anyone necessarily knows what even if the SCORE Act were to get passed, no one really knows what's going to happen. And I think that's part of why, you're starting to see these bills come up, and again, these are just individual members, so it's not necessarily reflective of the entire body or reflective of what's going to pass, but ones that are a lot more narrowed, a lot more like, okay, well, at least we can tackle this problem, at least we could do this thing, and kind of maybe do other legislation later that builds on it later. Like, I've wondered for a while whether a clean bill that very simply addresses eligibility, addresses transfer limits, whether that could pass on its own, and I guess we're maybe about to find out.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think from just a political standpoint of trying to narrow the scope, trying to see what you can actually move through, how people respond to things, because I do think that the more layers you add to it, the more difficult it's going to be to get, majority opinion and be able to move that through. We've talked for so long for these episodes about exactly this, and of course it keeps coming up because people keep wanting to just bring up the same topics, see how people feel about it, see what progress they can make, and it feels foolish to me, but I mean, maybe that's how Washington works. Maybe that's how you get stuff done. But for Tommy Tuberville to sit through these hearings, to sit through the roundtable at the White House, and then be able to bring this one forward and think, it's going to solve it. Like, we've seen all the courts rule. We've seen and you're just doing the same exact thing. You have, and I know we're going to get into the executive order conversation, but that happened. And at least for me, and maybe I go back to the echo chamber comment, maybe it's my echo chamber, but there's no athletes there. Everybody's reminding people about the Supreme Court rulings. Everybody's reminding people about how we got here. And the next real act that you have ignores all of those conversations and says, put a limit on transfers. I don't care what they think. It's just not going to happen.
Well, and that's kind of my point. Like when I talk about nobody's talking about it. Yes, we have the SCORE Act, but there's a reason it's not getting through. And there's people that should be a part of the conversation that are not part of the conversation. And so we're kind of sitting here waiting to see what happens.
Yeah, as far as the Tuberville bill goes, I forgot to even mention him when I kind of went through the major power players here. But clearly, he has a particular interest, particular viewpoint when it comes to college sports, being a former coach himself. And I mean, we could speak all we want about how ironic a coach like Tommy Tuberville is, or that he wants to limit transfers given some of his behavior as a college football coach, but he knows better than probably, a lot of other people in Congress what it's actually like, and what he probably talks to a ton of his former colleagues, a ton of coaches. He's probably the one center that has the clearest pulse on what the coaches are thinking. And clearly these are the big issues for the coaches. They want, clarification on eligibility. They want clarification on transfers. And that's what he's bringing forward.
And I think, again, we get into the polarizing side of it.
Yeah.
It's going to be really tough to get a bunch of people on the other side of the aisle to agree that those are the people who should have control of the decision making right now, and that the rules that are proposed and that any act of Congress should support that group in particular. And so it becomes very, very polarizing.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth noting that, one of the apparent additions to the SCORE Act in its, kind of circulated draft form is now the so-called Lane Kiffin rule that prohibits coaches from leaving in the middle of a season, which is just kind of, you see where a lot of these conversations are. And you see the fact that a lot of people cited Lane Kiffin leaving Ole Miss in the middle of their CFP run was a reason why the SCORE Act ultimately did not move forward back in the fall. And when you kind of look at the history, to look at kind of just the outcry all about that, I mean, it's hard to argue with that.
So we're really saying the toothpaste can't be put back in the tube. So all these things that are being thrown at the wall, we're guessing likely not going through. What we have seen is, you mentioned some of the divisiveness on Capitol Hill, and it's interesting to me that, again, we're not getting into political opinions, but it seems that this has almost become a partisan issue. So, Sam, why has it become a partisan issue where you've got one party thinking this way and one party thinking this way on something that seems pretty apolitical to me?
No, it's become a very partisan issue. It's become something where the involved Democrats have a very strong opinion on one side of things, and the involved Republicans have a very strong opinion on the other thing. And I say involved because, again, I want to emphasize that it really does seem like most of Congress they're consumed with other matters, and frankly, I understand that. But if you look at kind of the sides of this, the tendency definitely is, and there are exceptions on both sides. But the tendency definitely is that the Republicans are very much looking for kind of, give the NCAA the power it needs to enforce its rules, be able to promulgate new rules that kind of help create stability in college sports, while the Democrats are very much focused more on athlete health and safety, ensuring kind of more parity across the board, and really just, I mean, and I think you look at it and you say, okay, well, it kind of reflects a larger thing as well, where Democrats tend to be on the side of unions and Republicans tend to be on the side of management. And those are exactly, two big forces that are going on here, because the unions are involved. All the professional sports leagues, pro player associations have gotten involved, to say nothing of the fledgling unions like athletes.org. And of course the NCAA and the conferences are involved, and NCAA and conferences are the ones pushing Republicans largely, and the unions are the ones pushing the Democrats largely.
With that, I want to go into our next question, and you kind of touched on it. It really depends on who's making these decisions, right? But if you take 1,000-foot view, who do you believe stands to benefit the most from congressional involvement in college athletics? And there may not be a clear-cut answer to that.
No, there is the NCAA. I mean, there's a reason they've spent so much money lobbying Congress. They really feel like they need it. And I mean, there's a reason in the first place. Charlie Baker is the NCAA president, former governor of Massachusetts. That's not an accident. in the opening statement, in the statement that they made announcing its hire back all those years ago, they specifically pointed to, we need to lobby Congress. We need to get Congress involved here. This has been a goal of the NCAA. This has been the North Star of the NCAA for years now, is getting congressional action. And there's a reason for it. It's because there's so much instability in college sports, yes, and that instability is benefiting, at the very least, the top cut of athletes, the ones who want to be able to transfer every year, who want to be able to take advantage of kind of really essentially unlimited NIL opportunities. And yeah, so the NCAA definitely stands to benefit a lot more from congressional action.
I agree with you. I think that we've talked before about how sometimes in these conversations, it becomes centered on the top end of the athletes and the top 3 to 5% of the athletes. And I do think there are benefits available to the vast majority of athletes through some sort of congressional action. But I think where I completely agree with you is that more or less anything that comes out of Congress will be a compromise for the athletes compared to the current state of affairs. So I think that the NCAA stands to benefit the most. I think that there are some athletes who could benefit from standardized care and different things about like the best practices that could come out of, some congressional action that would be a compromise when ultimately, if something is able to cross the aisle, if you will. But yeah, I mean, right now, anything that would be an act of Congress would be cementing what the NCAA is asking for and would be going back against some sort of court ruling or anything else that has been in favor of athletes to this point. So I think by and large, the NCAA is the one lobbying through millions of dollars, trying to make this happen because it will benefit them the most. But the vast majority of athletes who are not going to be making millions of NIL dollars and not going to be, professional in their sport could benefit from something if it's done appropriately.
Joe, take me behind the curtain a little bit from an athletics administrator. You've got all this stuff happening in DC that could potentially impact you, but you can't rely on that to be your final decision maker. You've got schools at the SEC Big Ten level that are trying to put their own legislation into place. So put yourself at a mid-major. What are those conversations happening to prepare for what could be something from Congress, could be nothing, could be dictated by a higher level conference? I mean, how do you prepare in a time of uncertainty?
I mean, I think that's the big question. I mean, right now, all the focus seems to be on getting Congress to do something. So that's option 1A. Like, what is option 1B? How are we as a department, every department throughout the country preparing for this? And, I think, Mike and I, when we were architecting, Boise State's NIL program, before NIL passed, this is what we think it could look like. But then we had options B, C, and D, depending on what rules actually came out. And then obviously Alston happened, and all of the guardrails went out the window. But I mean, I think that's what you have to do. The problem, I don't think people realize how busy college athletics administrators are. Like, your athletic director, your deputy AD, your senior staff, those people are working 80 plus hours a week. And so to then carve out extra time to think about the what ifs, that's a difficult proposition. You better hope you've got, assistant ADs and associate ADs and all of these people in position that are forward thinking, intelligent, taking it upon themselves to plan for, if this happens, we could do this. If this happens, we could do this. If this happens, we could pivot. From the top level all the way down through your leadership, you have to have people that are thinking about things, and you don't know what's going to happen. So you're not carving out time with your AD, as an assistant AD saying, "Hey, I thought about this." You're putting stuff, on paper, like Mike and I were doing. If this happens, we'll bring it up. But it's really hard. They're incredibly busy. So that's probably a lot of the reason why we're seeing people, try to put a bunch of the eggs in the congressional basket.
And I think it's also part of the reason a lot of the conversation ends up at the conference level, because now you can institutions can kind of pool resources where it's like, hey, yeah, if we hire, if the conference office hires a deputy commissioner, associate commissioner type position, it might cost a couple $100,000 to get a high level person in there, but you spread that cost across the 10 to 16 members of a conference, and all of a sudden your distribution isn't that much smaller, and there might be some ROI there. So it's really an investment into headcount at that level who can then work toward it, be able to bring something forward. That's a lot more of a burden if you're going to try to hire somebody at the school level for a similar salary, and you're going to take that all on yourself and hope that it helps you. So I think that's part of it. I think that's part of why you're seeing it matriculate to the conference level. And I think that we saw Greg Sankey just a couple of weeks ago talking about, the position of his conference with the SEC. And I think you can kind of read between the lines of what he said, that they are working on Plan 1B. And yes, he's been very involved from a political standpoint to make sure that their voice is heard. But he said he wants to be able to work with all the at least P4 conferences to be able to come up with the plan. And it sounded a little bit like what you've talked about like get in a room, figure it out. We know the problems. How can we help each other? But he also said, if that's not able to happen, maybe we'll do it ourselves. And that's always the threat looming over this. And so he knows what he's doing. And I think that he has the power to, if he doesn't have the power to get the political thing done and get an executive order done by golfing, then he's going to figure out how to get it done at the college level. And he's probably the one that can do it.
Yeah, from the outside looking in, any athletic department that is solely planning based on we're going to get something done from Congress is not doing their jobs. And yeah, I've fully realized that, they have plenty of their jobs anyway, but they really, especially with how long it's been and how long Congress has been kind of debating really the same issues over and over. Congressional action does not seem to be on the near horizon. We're about to enter we're in an election year, a midterm year, and members of Congress are going to very soon, if they're not already, get more consumed with that than they are with any sort of real lawmaking. So yeah, like athletic departments and conferences definitely need to be planning based on something from Congress is not going to happen, and clearly I'm saying that as if I don't expect that they are. I'm sure they are.
Let's say Congress doesn't act, nothing comes of this. Mike, you touched on it already, but the idea of an executive order, how feasible is that? What would that look like?
It's a little scary because we've seen previous executive orders around college sports that have essentially led to nothing. And I think that kind of to the point we just discussed, like it feels like the most impactful outcome of an executive order would be to put the NCAA and its member institutions in a really bad spot and set them up for failure. Because we heard enough from that roundtable at the White House about the direction of where we would expect an executive order to go. And the comment was, take everything back to what it used to be and ram it through a court, as if we haven't tried that. And so if anyone's going to get this executive order and then look at it and think, oh, now we can act the way we've wanted to act, that doesn't mean the courts are going to agree. It doesn't mean that lawmaking will change. It doesn't mean that the outcomes of these things will change. And so it's a little scary. I'm not all the way like danger zone on this, because it doesn't appear to me that there's too many schools or the NCAA itself who's just sitting there waiting for this to come out and thinking it's going to be this safe harbor for them to act, in a certain way. So I don't foresee it really being like a massive issue. Again, we've had a previous executive order around this and nothing happened, and it didn't seem to change the way people operated. And so I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal, but it's going to be a headline. It's going to be a talking point. It's going to be, to your point, part of the 80 hours a week that an athletic director and their delegates are working is answering questions from their constituents and talking to their people and there's a lot of people who are going to look at it and go, oh, well, now you've got what you need. And it's like, kind of, yeah. So then you have to keep talking about that and you have to work your way through it. And so it is more work. It's a headline that's going to cause a lot of people to do a lot of work. And we've seen a lot of those, but I don't think that it'll change really anything. And so it's hard to fathom that that's like what anybody's waiting for, I guess, back to your point. And I hope it's not.
Well, the one question I do have on that is, this administration has shown that they're willing to do things differently. And so an executive order in the past may not have had much in the way of teeth, but are there mechanisms or levers that can be pulled that really force everybody's hand? That's the question. If this is what I want to happen, and if you don't follow what I want to happen, this is getting taken away.
I mean, I'll let Sam chime in more, but like, I don't think it can force the Supreme Court's hand.
No,
I don't think it can force Congress's hand. And so my point is, if it forces the school's hand, it puts them in a really precarious position.
correct. I guess the point I'm getting at, the courts take so long, like,
Sure.
unless there's some emergency thing, but I don't know how that works. Like, I'm not gonna lie. Like, if the president puts out an executive order and he's the one who seems to be able to have the ability to get, the emergency, Supreme Court attention. Again, this goes back to you. I don't even know why I'm talking about it, but if there's an executive order and he wants it to have teeth, is there a mechanism or lever that he could put to force department's hands? And yes, that he even said it's going to get challenged in courts, but that process is lengthy.
I think he thought his tariffs had teeth.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, executive orders can only impact the executive branch, and the problems facing the NCAA right now solely involve legislation, which is different branch of Congress. The president, through executive order, can't change antitrust law, and he can't change employment law, and those are the two big things. And he can't change state law. Can't tell the states that your laws are null and void. If you look at all three priorities of the NCAA right now in their lobbying actions, the president has no power to do anything on his own to impact any of those three, from at least from the perspective the NCAA wants them to do it. Realistically, and I'm going to use the phrase realistically because, as you said, Joe, this administration has shown the it has shown the desire to do things differently, and as you said, Mike, he has said at the round table that he wants to do something a lot more substantial. But realistically, what the president can do is he can direct Department of Justice to issue guidance through their antitrust division that eligibility rules, for example, do not violate antitrust law. You can direct the Department of Labor to issue guidance to say the college athletes should not be considered employees. But at the end of the day, though, that's just guidance. That's just administrative guidance. That's just regulatory authority. That's not something. Yeah, it's something that the courts will look at as persuasive authority potentially, but it's not something that's going to be binding on them. It's not something that's going to overrule the precedent that we've already set in Alston and Johnson and all these other cases like Pavia and it's really just something where. Yeah, the president can put something together that is a lot more broad, a lot more comprehensive, but it will get challenged in court. And, yes, it does take a while for these things to happen, but there's also preliminary injunctions. And while, of course, we had a recent Supreme Court ruling that does limit the amount that, the idea of a universal injunction, it's still something where, this is not going to be something you can have this executive order that purports to change all this law, but it's not something that's going to have any kind of major effect because it simply can't. The Constitution doesn't allow for it. The Constitution doesn't allow for the president to overrule statutory authority, and for good reason.
Dumb it down even more. Does presidential interest influence on college athletics benefit the NCAA?
I would actually say no. I would say that it could be incredibly harmful to the NCAA for reasons that I think people aren't talking about. And this also applies to bills like the SCORE Act, for example. But there is one piece of precedent, even going back beyond Alston, that could impact the NCAA here and could change. And it's a piece of precedent. It's Supreme Court precedent that the NCAA has very much relied on in the past. But the more and more the federal government gets involved, the more and more a court potentially has the opportunity to say, hey, things have changed. And that is NCAA v. Tarkanian. Tarkanian was a 5-4 decision back in 1988 that said that the NCAA is not a state actor for the purposes of the Fifth Amendment due process clause. The situation behind it was that, Jerry Tarkanian, he was the coach at UNLV. He was told by the NCAA, or UNLV was told by the NCAA because of these recruiting violations that you had to either had to fire him or you were going to be punished yourself. And the UNLV said, okay, we're going to fire him. And Tarkanian said, I didn't get proper due process here. I'm going to file a lawsuit against UNLV. UNLV said, hey, that's great. We're happy to get an injunction against us that forces us to keep you. But then the NCAA got involved. The NCAA said, well, it's actually us who's doing this action here. We don't have to follow due process because we're not a state actor. And eventually the Supreme Court took the case, and they, again, at a 5-4 decision, they agreed. But the whole theory behind Arcadian was that the NCAA is not, they're not a government body. They're the ones influencing the state instead of the state influencing the NCAA. But if we see that change, if we see that calculus change, and this is a paper, shout outs to my colleagues, Neil Turnus and Joe Sabin, we're working on a paper on this. We could absolutely see a change in the way that courts view the NCAA's position as a state actor, where if the more and more they're influenced by Congress, by the president, by the federal government, the more and more they derive power from the federal government, the more likely it could be seen that, for one, they're a state actor, which brings up First Amendment issues, which brings up due process issues, which brings up all these different constitutional issues that they right now don't have to deal with. And for two, could also implicate them in terms of Title IX as well, which is something that they have been very happy to, ever since the Smith decision back in 99, they've been very happy where the schools have to follow Title IX, the NCAA corporate office does not.
All right, let's put a bow on this. Our unilateral, we chose a word that's really hard to say quickly, so I apologize. Our unilateral decision of the show, if you're campaigning to your local congressional member, what's the one thing you think is a must for college sports legislation moving forward?
My answer is stability. Like, we have a lot of issues, and we've talked about all of them at length. Actually, we probably haven't. There's probably more. So stability. Like, if you're going to have one thing, stability. But everything I'm hearing from Sam, and everything we've talked about on this one, I don't know that I'm lobbying Congress. If I'm sitting in the chair, I'm probably lobbying. And when I say chair, if I'm an AD, I'm probably lobbying to bring the rest of the industry together to try to solve this without congressional action, without an executive order. Because hearing Sam talk about everything, that tells me if you leave it in somebody else's hands, it's probably not going to go as well for you.
There. Sam, Mike?
My take's a little different on this. Personally, I think it would be pretty irresponsible of Congress to grant the NCAA pretty much anything that they're lobbying for. And so for myself, I take a little bit different approach, and I look and say, if I'm going to Congress or if I'm, kind of leading this charge on what could help, I still think that anything at the congressional level should be of national interest. And I don't think that, protections for institutions and commercial gain for athletes, I don't think that those are really the things that need to be on their table. But I do think that you can kind of thread a needle to where you can find something that is nationally relevant and that there's interest at a national level with Olympic development. And I think that the U.S. is different than a lot of other developed nations in the lack of subsidy for Olympic development. And a lot of that in a lot of sports, and not just sports, I think it's important to note that, you've got a lot of bobsled athletes. Obviously didn't do bobsled when they were in college, but the fact that they had the training available to them during those formative years of their athletic life as a collegiate athlete, whether that be a track athlete or something else, is really important. And I think that the USOC, through, this goes through a lot of different court decisions and ideas between the NCAA, the AAU. There's a lot here. It's not as if this has never been discussed, but the U.S. as an Olympic body has more or less outsourced Olympic development to colleges. And I've brought this up in a different venue before. When my promotion and relegation document got published, there was a lot in there about preserving the American Olympic model. And part of that is the colleges. And there's a way, I think, for Congress to act. There's a lot of different ways where it could be multimedia rights providers. It could be the sponsors who benefit from Olympic athletes being household names during the Olympics and perhaps before the Olympics. You know, the NBCs, where it's like, hey, if people watching beach volleyball during the Summer Olympics, the more people that watch, the better for NBC. So how do we make sure that people are interested in beach volleyball year round and throughout the 4-year Olympic cycle? That's just one example. Swimming, another. Wrestling. I mean, there's all kinds of examples. Those groups could help. Congress could also help. They could help through subsidizing a lot of the work. They could help through grants. They could help through just certifications to allow, schools have to provide X whatever for training and different things to be considered an Olympic development program. And all of a sudden there's funding that comes from that. They could provide safeguards for the athletes to where if there's sports that are of high priority for the USOC and the United States, that they could provide guardrails to say, this has to be provided to these athletes. This has to be provided to these athletes because these athletes in these sports are of great interest to the United States. And I think that there's a lot that can be done there. I don't want to overshadow the fact that college sports has proven to be a really great Olympic development model, not just through Team USA medal counts, but also the vast number of international athletes who go on to compete for their nations on the Olympic stage. And I think it is of national interest to preserve this Olympic development model that has been built. And not to say that anything congressional is going to ruin what exists, but the current Olympic model could be collateral damage if all of the focus is on football, men's basketball, women's basketball. And so how can you get Congress to act in a way that will help protect and preserve that, which I think a knock-on effect could also be that if you get some of that solved, you can go solve football by itself, and you can go solve men's and women's basketball by itself. And so my answer is a little bit different, but that is where I would steer some of the conversation because I think it is of national interest, which I think is important when it comes to congressional conversations.
All right, Sam.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly important. And the unfortunate reality is that the subsidies for Olympic sports over the past several decades have been football players not getting paid. That's just the unfortunate reality of it. So I definitely agree with everything you're saying, Mike. For my, what I'd be pitching, in terms of what Congress actually should be doing here, I'm going to go to eligibility. I think that eligibility is a huge issue right now, and it's not just because the NCAA is itself is completely in flux because they keep getting sued, dozens and dozens of times over the past year over for athletes being found that they've exhausted their years and they want to be able to play another year and all these different things. Because there's an effect on this, and that effect is the athletes don't know the rules. The athletes are confused. The athletes don't understand why they can't get another year and these other athletes can. And I don't blame them. They have a lot of these athletes have really impactful situations, legitimate reasons why they should be getting another year, legitimate hardship applications. But it's pretty clear that a lot of people in the NCAA are so tired of getting sued that that's impacting the way they're handling these waivers. And I feel like it needs to be taken out of the NCAA's hands. It needs to be something that you have, at least as an appellate right, you have some kind of impartial arbitration to be able to determine this medical hardship or, any other kind of hardship waiver, because you're seeing, a lot of these lawsuits, and yes, a lot of these lawsuits are athletes saying, I want to get an extra year so I can get paid another year. Let's not diminish that reality. But there's also lawsuits, involving players that, had a really major medical issue. Tyrone Grant Foster at Gonzaga is a huge headliner here. He literally almost died on the court, and the NCAA said that, that didn't entitle him to an extra year. A lot of these athletes, I mean, the NCAA has just been very inconsistent. They've been very arbitrary when it comes to these hardship waivers. And we need to have some sort of system where if we're going to have the Tommy Tuberville thing where we're going to codify, 4 seasons in 5 years, or maybe we do 5 and 5. If we're going to codify, you can only transfer once. There needs to be an impartial way to get waivers to those rules. There needs to be meaningful exceptions, to quote Judge Connolly in the Fragmented case. There needs to be, meaningful exceptions here to allow athletes to have a legitimate day in court, I say in court, but a legitimate day to be able to plead their case. And especially when we're talking about just the sheer amount of money that's now in play, because it's now an economic right. It's now an economic interest. And yeah, that needs to happen.
A lot of good takes, a lot of good nuanced opinions about the political landscape of college athletics. I'm ready to write in vote all three to be my next congressman. So thank you everyone for joining us. We got plenty more to talk about. Maybe next episode we get into professional athletes competing at the amateur level a couple years later. Lots to talk about on unilateral decisions. We'll see you next time.